The book I would suggest is Slow Violence, The Environmentalism of the Poor by Rob Nixon. And it comes at this from a very different perspective. So it's environmental humanities. So here is someone who's saying that we can't just leave climate change, environmental destruction to the biologists, geologists, demographers, etc., but that there's a profoundly social component that goes into constructing the environment. Even if it's understood not to be a built environment, it still is human interaction. And so takes more of an eco-social approach to understanding this interface between the human and the more than human, and the ways in which we live and be in this world. It's really asking questions from a different optic. It's asking us to think about, for instance, how is statehood performed in a certain epoch in which mega dams become the way you demonstrate modernity, progress, and sort of telegraph to the rest of the world that you are a powerful nation state by building these enormous dams. This would ask us to think both about the dam building and statehood and performances of statehood, but also to ask questions about what happens to all those people who used to live there, where water now runs or does not. And what does it mean to be either a developmental refugee or a climate change refugee? So these different reasons that people are forced into movement, not necessarily of their own volition. And there are a number of ideas in the book that I think are fascinating. And his term slow violence is so important. It's been very helpful for me to think with, because coming from a human rights background, we tend to be more temporally fixed, violation-centric, bodily injury, etc., the enshrined first-generation rights. And yet slow violence is that kind that accumulates across time. So it's the lead that leaches into water, or a dam that converts the river, diverts a river and causes a drought here and yet flooding there. And so it's looking at the slower accumulation of violence and violences, in the plural perhaps, over a person's lifetime. I find it very powerful. And as he says, it doesn't make for the sensational headlines. So you don't get a crash or a bomb, or occasionally maybe a glacier calves, that kind of gets some kind of following. But it's so that it's not as media friendly, and yet probably results in one of the key sources of displacement, refugee status, poverty, etc. So for instance, the dam projects, a mega dam project. What do you call all the people who no longer can live on that enormous swath of land that is now a river or a dam? We don't necessarily think of them as climate refugees, but they are to some extent. They're escaping failed development projects, or development projects that certainly fell unevenly upon the shoulders of the intended beneficiaries, which is another concept that he introduces that I have found very productive, is this idea of unimagined communities. And I love it. So most folks have read Benedict Anderson back in the day and are familiar with this idea of imagined communities in the nation state and print capitalism, and how it is that we start to feel that we have a sense of nationness. But he's arguing within that allegedly homogeneous time and space of the nation state, there's a process of actively unimagining certain groups of people. And those are the folks that are somehow disposable, somehow expendable, whose life ways or ways of being in the world perhaps have just been obliterated, right, in the name of progress, modernity, and stateliness. And so his idea of unimagined communities is very productive in terms of figuring out which groups are made invisible in the name of a nation state, and how are they actively unimagined, because you do have to work at making people invisible and unimaginable and hiding the destruction that might take place in their lives. So I have found it as a very important human element to discussions of climate change and environmentalism. And I also think we can begin to get at some of the gendered dimensions of it as well, because frequently it is women who are subsistence agriculturalists. It's women who may be on the receiving end of some of the environmental toxins. One of the lines that sticks out for me is that the womb is our first environment. And the idea that from the very moment of conception, what are we exposed to? Because our mothers have been exposed to toxins or chemicals or lead that is leached into the water. So it asks us in this term slow violence to look at across a lifespan what that might mean. It's not violation centric. It's not that day that the police arrested and beat you, which is also horrific. It's that long accumulation of harm across a lifespan that is the slower, less sensational, less media friendly, put it on the front page kind of violence that affects millions of people in this world.